the physical experiments, for those particular jurisdictions, and then every 4 years we have a more important popularity contest where we determine who the most important physicist is going to be for the next 4 years. And that's the way we ensure the supremacy of this approach to discovering how the natural world works, such as our devotion to science. That's what we go ahead and implement. Doesn't that sound nutty, what I just said? Okay, so by the same token, right, over time humans refined their notion of what we now call freedom, meaning individual liberty, because freedom can mean all kinds of things. When we talk about are people free, we don't mean, one thing is you can talk about a slave market and say, wow, that's very inexpensive. I thought I would have to pay a lot for that slave. But that's not what we mean if we say people are free. We also don't mean they have the ability to just snap their fingers and be jumping around. You don't have the ability to do that. Nobody's going to say, oh, so you're really not free, right? So when we talk about people being free, yes, it is a very particular type of thing we mean by that if we're saying it in a political context or ideological context, right? And it's important, I get it. And so it does not follow that that's why we need to have this machinery of coercion in place that Yaron Brook says, oh, that's a government, we need it. It does not follow at all. Okay, let's move on.
Because to be free, coercion must be extracted from the equation. Coercion is not something one negotiates. Violence is not something one arbitrates. Violence is something that should be avoided. It should be extracted.
Okay, again, same pattern. You're gonna get sick of hearing me document this, but I just want to go through and just show how many times he does this, makes this rhetorical move. He says, oh, we need to have violence extracted from, coercion sucked out of it, all right, for this enterprise to work. Okay, well then, what you obviously can't have and can't endorse is a political state, because by its very nature, it rests on coercion. It says this institution must be the monopolist provider of judicial services in this region. Again, it doesn't mean, the state can say, oh, if you're a homeowner and someone breaks into your house and you use your shotgun to kill a guy, that's fine. You're allowed to do that. Okay, but even there, so it's not that the state is claiming to have a monopoly on the lawful use of violence, but it's claiming that it determines when a use of violence has been lawful. Okay? And so the state is claiming to have a monopoly on that. Okay? You can quibble, and somebody can argue about what exactly is it that the state's claiming it has a monopoly on. I don't want to get in the weeds on that. But clearly, it's claiming some type of supreme authority in some dimension within at least a certain jurisdiction. Okay? Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be a state. And you'll notice, if you go and click through and watch the actual debate, Ryan Kaplan, when he gets up, he says, I'll just anticipate it a little bit, that he talks about that surely Yaron Brook he doesn't want there to be a one world government, right? And then, okay, but once you open the door to a bunch of smaller political units covering planet Earth, then he's saying, if Yaron Brook is okay with that, presumably he is, because probably Yaron Brook's not going to get up there and say we need a one world government, then Kaplan's point was, how is that, okay, so that's compatible then with one vision of anarcho-capitalism in which companies buy large tracts of land and then they set the rules just on the boundaries of what is their land, their property. And then people are free to move. But, well, actually I should be careful. They're not free to just go onto somebody else's property without the owner's permission. Just like you can't just go into somebody's house if they don't let you in. But the idea is people would move from place to place based on the policies they prefer. Right? Just like restaurants are competing for your dollars, if you live in the United States, you want to go out to eat. And likewise, you'd have these different regions all privately owned, there are different rules and such, and people would decide where they want to live. Okay? And Kaplan's point was that at a high enough level, or a low enough resolution, if that's the way we talk about it, that is compatible with Yaron Brook's framework. It's just the way that the rules are determined on each plot of land is different. And the decision makers, if that's the generic term you want to use, for each plot of land is selected in a way that we, from our libertarian perspective, think is more legitimate than the way a globe full of political states, how they might have elections or have hereditary monarchy or whatever, that you would say, even though, yes, there's a functional sense in which these systems are equivalent, that there's a group of humans who at any given time are kind of making important decisions affecting the inhabitants on those plots of land, that some systems are more congruent with our a priori notions of libertarian justice. Okay, but again, at a functional level. So Kaplan went through all that. And what I want to say is, Yarn and Brook just declaring at the outset that, oh yeah, what we need is for there to be no coercion involved. That's the ideal, at least, of what the state tries to achieve. That's like saying we want to have a black hole in order to shine some light on a situation. Like, no, by its very nature, the state cannot do what Yarn Brook wants it to do. So it may be that a system of privately held plots of land where the owners set their rules and whatever, maybe that would lead to outcomes we don't like. Like, for example, maybe the property owners would advertise as, hey, come live here because we promise we will just we'll take 1% of your income every year. And we'll call that like a homeowners association fee. And so, it's not a tax, right? And assuming it was all voluntary on the front end and people decided, yeah, okay. And assuming at the outset we were basically okay as libertarian theorists with the fact that, oh yeah, the people who are making these announcements really are the legitimate owners. They didn't just get a bunch of guns and decide, hey, we're the people running this property, this plot of land that's giant, okay? But still, they might engage in fraud. The people might move in there, and then once they get settled, then the property owners change the rules on it and say, oh yeah, even though we signed contracts and everything saying we were going to take 1% of your income, turns out, you know what, that we're worried about these foreign aggressors maybe invading or whatever, so we're going to actually bump it up. Now we're going to take 1.7% of your income, and you really don't have a say in it. And maybe that violates the clear letter of what the contracts were when people moved in. That could happen, right? I can't prove to you that that's literally impossible. Surely, yeah, that could happen. But my point is it's not guaranteed to happen by the very nature of private property and people signing contracts, right? It's conceivable they will adhere to what the contract said, in which case the interactions would continue to be voluntary and consensual. Whereas the nature of the state per se rests on coercion. Okay, so that, again, it's weird that Yarn Brook is holding that up as a goal to be established, to say we're trying to extract violence or coercion out of the system, and that's why we need governments, in the sense that he attributes to that term. When no, the thing he is defining as a government cannot be free of coercion. It rests on coercion. If it didn't, even Yarn Brook would agree it wouldn't be a government, the way he's using that term. Okay, let's move on.
And the protection of individual rights necessitates a government. It necessitates some kind of institution that actually serves to extract that coercion from society. An institution that subordinates society to this moral idea of rights. That doesn't just happen. That's not something you negotiate. That is just something that is.
So again, here he's just saying incantations and waving his hands and trying to do a magic spell. He's just saying, you don't negotiate, it just is. Oh, okay. I mean, would we say that about science? Or how do we ensure the progress in mathematics? Is there some sort of process of negotiate, like people write proofs and they submit them to journals and then other experts look at it and we decide through community consensus whether No. It just is. You can say that, but without giving some procedure by which the is gets achieved, it's kind of empty words. And again, too, at some level, I could say, right, sure, whatever it is, this ideal you're holding, like for example, I am for the rule of law. And Yarn Brook might object and say, well, no, you're not, because you actually want market forces to be determined, in terms of the codification of property rights, and you want to have private judges rendering decisions in cases where both parties take their disputes to a particular judge based on his or her reputation, and it's not that every few years there's an election in which a judge is just appointed and then all the crimes of a certain nature get assigned to a particular judge, and just going through, and it's in Murphy, in your system, like the set of rules that are most profitable bubble up to the top, and that's what gets implemented instead of having this rival system. I say, okay, right. And my argument is that procedure is more likely to produce results that achieve this abstract goal we have in mind. So just to go back to my math example, just because a bunch of people who are called mathematicians, they might even have degrees after their PhDs and such after their name, come from a good pedigree, they might say crazy stuff. There might be some proof that they say is valid when it really isn't. So just their say-so doesn't make it valid. That's true. But when you say, okay, what's the best way to ensure that the things that the practicing community come to embrace and hold up as correct mathematical proofs, it's not going to be based on having a popularity contest every 4 years and having this group of so-called experts that the public votes on. The public doesn't know much about mathematical proofs, and then they go and appoint the right people to go and oversee the development of mathematics to make sure only correct proofs get elevated. We're going to have the political process kind of ultimately in charge of that. No, that would be crazy. That's not going to work. And just because Yaron Brook goes, no, we can't have mathematical truth being decided through correspondence, and so no, it just is. That doesn't help us any.
The idea that defense agencies can compete on a, quote, free market for retaliatory force is incoherent. For free market is one from which force has effectively already been banished. But defense agencies are actually treating innocent force in the lack of freedom, in the use of its negation.
Again, he's just asserting things. So why can't defense agencies negotiate? It would reduce costs. See, so this is the thing. Right now, if there's some international incident, let's say some group of people from Mexico sneaks over the border and robs a bank in Texas and then goes back into Mexico, we're pretty confident that the Mexican and U.S. authorities are going to discuss the matter and come to a resolution. It's probably not going to result in the U.S. sending in the Marines to go take out battalions of the Mexican army in order to bring these fugitives to justice. That's not going to happen. So how is that possible? It's not because there was a one world government overseeing that. It's just, no, you got two powerful organizations side by side and there's a dispute. They often recognize that it's not in our interest to go to war with each other over that. And so that logic would apply for private defense agencies, or whatever you want to call them. Except all the more so, because they more directly bear the true economic cost of their activities, more so than a political state does. So the example I like to use is when Bill Clinton was president, there was this period where the Monica Lewinsky scandal was really heating up, and then he gave the order to fire a bunch of cruise missiles into the Sudan because they said, oh, we've got the reports that this particular factory is making chemical weapons or something, and it turned out to be they're like making aspirin. The way the anti-war movement was talking about was, oh yeah, Bill Clinton just bombed an aspirin factory. Or maybe they were making other pharmaceutical products besides literally just aspirin. But it was, I think, pretty well acknowledged that this cruise missile strike was not valid. There weren't actually some terrorist cell in there that was cranking out chemical and biological weapons, which was what the ostensible reason was. At the time, I thought the reason he did that was to get Monica Lewinsky off the front page of the papers. So I can't prove that. Let's say that's true though, but firing cruise missiles is very expensive. But Bill Clinton's decision was not at all influenced by, I would have to go explain myself to the shareholders at the next quarterly meeting because I'm the head of a corporation and these missiles are part of our inventory, and if I fire them off, well, now we have fewer assets on our corporate balance sheet. So the shareholders are going to want a reckoning to say, well, why did you do that? And I'm not going to just want to say, well, it's because there was a sex scandal that was killing me in the polls and I wanted to change the news cycle. That's not going to fly. Okay, so just showing the huge difference in how expenditures affect decision makers when the organization is truly private versus when it's a public entity of which the political officials are mere stewards or caretakers. That actually changes the way they view the assets under their temporary control. And so, since among other things, open warfare is very costly, other things equal, you would expect adjacent organizations that are privately owned to be more judicious and cautious about engaging in warfare with their neighbors.
Now look, I'm not defending existing governments. Unfortunately, our institutions are being corrupted. They were maybe corrupt from the beginning, or at least had the seeds of that corruption from the beginning. But they still need to be corrupted and gotten worse over the last 100-something years, certainly in this country and in parts of Europe. But the fact that an institution is being corrupted does not mean we erase it. We reject it. Universities are corrupt. Our healthcare system is corrupt. We don't reject healthcare and reject universities. We go in and fix them. We identify what's wrong. We identify what the problem is. We identify the source of the corruption, and we eradicate the source of the corruption. So government today is corrupt. It's just another gang.
So you see this move a lot, where Yarnbrook is sitting here telling us all the horrors of anarchy, and that's why we need states or governments, his terminology, and then just casually admitting, no, of course, nobody's saying governments. The governments didn't, they started out corrupt and they've just gotten worse over time, and at this point, the government is just another gang. So why is this a ringing endorsement of your approach? At least one could argue, that's kind of like a common rhetorical move, is to say to the anarcho-capitalist theorist, say, oh, give me an example in history where someone's tried your idea. That's what I thought. And okay, fair enough. And you could point to stuff like David Friedman's written stuff on ancient Iceland, medieval Iceland, and things like that. And you could certainly make general comparisons about the benefits of freedom, and look at North versus South Korea, East versus West Germany, and then so you can clearly make an empirical case that more freedom is better than less freedom, and blah blah blah, and just say our ideas have not been fully implemented. And you can do things like that. But we could also flip it and say, okay, you're right, there hasn't been a country of 30 million people that's had Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism in effect that we can point to and say, yep, that's exactly the textbook definition of what we're talking about here. That's true. But by the same token, that means then if we ever could get that up and running, maybe it would work. We don't know that it wouldn't work. In contrast, someone who says, oh, we just need to go back to the U.S. Constitution, I would say, why would it work this time? You're not going to get a group of political thinkers and statesmen of the caliber of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, right? Who's good right now? What is it? Is Newt Gingrich our era's James Madison? No. I like Jim Jordan. Is he Thomas Jefferson? No. Right? So who? And the fact that with those founding fathers, the system did not last and turned into today's system shows they did not build a lasting structure. That the so-called chains of the Constitution turned out not to be so restrictive after all. And so to say, oh, we just need to go back to that, this time we mean it, well, that's goofy. We know that's not going to work. Right? So I could just as well say to Yarnbrook, your ideal of limited government has been shown decisively to not work. How many examples over the course of history do we need to point to show a people had a government that was relatively small and it just grew over time to become tyrannical? By your own definition, Yarnbrook. Right? It's not that it just happened once, it happened everywhere it's been tried. Right? Just like communism has never worked, we say limited government has never worked ever. And so, yeah, I agree. It would be nice if we had all kinds of working examples of anarcho-capitalism, but if they had started and then got snuffed out, that might be a strike against them. So at least we can say nobody has ever really tried our particular ideas before.
And look, anarchy exists today. Any place the government leaves a little room for competing with it, you have anarchy. The government leaves spaces and things that it bans. So we get organized crime, cartels, mafias. And yes, it's competition between gangs, between the mafia, the cartels, and the government.
Okay, so here I'm going to engage in some actual economic analysis for those of you who are saying, geez, we're about 30, 40 minutes into the episode. We're kind of waiting for economics, Bob. Here you go. The latest been worth it, I hope. So here, Yarnbrook, he's engaging in what you might call like anarchy in the gaps or something, that kind of a rhetorical move, where you have a system that is undisputably, unequivocally subject to a state. In fact, the very type of state that Yarnbrook is holding up and saying, right now in the present world, this is the best example of what I have in mind, even though it's not living up to my ideals, but this is what I have in mind. And then, because under the jurisdiction and ostensible control and oversight of this benevolent state that's there to make sure the world is free of coercion and to uphold and protect individual rights, the fact that under the operation of that thing, we have pockets of lawlessness, Yarnbrook's going to point to that failure of the state to provide what it said it's going to provide and say, aha, see what anarchy gets you? And that's just nutty. So to not jump right now into literal crimes, property crimes and violence against other people, let me switch examples for a second just to make sure you understand the pattern. Whenever there was a bad plane crash, by bad I mean like something bad happened and then like they did investigations and found out that, oh yeah, there weren't adequate checks, flight logs and whatever in the maintenance of the planes. And so there'd be calls to increase the FAA's funding for foreign enlisters. That's the Federal Aviation Administration. It's the federal government agency that's in charge of regulating commercial air flight units, air travel in the United States. Okay, so the big passenger jets that people get into to fly from New York to LA and such, the FAA is definitely in charge of that. And if you said, why do we need the FAA? Why don't we just let the free market regulate it? People would say, oh my gosh, can you imagine how unsafe planes would be? The airlines would just, they would stop changing the oil, and they would stop doing routine maintenance checks in order to save a few dollars, because that's how raw capitalism works. We need the FAA in place to ensure safety. Right? So, like I say, there was a bad plane crash. It was in the Everglades when I was a kid growing up. And there were all sorts of calls. They had hearings and blah, blah, blah. And the end result was people were calling for the FAA to get more funding, because clearly they were understaffed. They couldn't be, they couldn't do their job right. They didn't have enough funding. So I made the point that what would it look like for this, what would it have to look like if this were a bad system, right? That you've got two approaches. One is to trust Washington, D.C. based agencies to oversee the commercial airlines. And another approach would be using more market mechanisms. And so suppose it were the case that federal regulation was not the best way to provide safety in commercial flights. What would that look like? Wouldn't it look like when the FAA was definitely in charge, planes crashing, and people going and looking and saying, oh, they didn't do routine maintenance like they should have? Isn't that what it would look like? And yet people would point to that and say, see, this is why we need a strong FAA. And so, it's like, if you didn't have a government regulation, you just had laissez-faire, and there was a plane crash, people would point to that and say, oh, that's the failure of the free market. We need regulation from the government. So then we have a bunch of regulation from the government, and there's a crash, and people say, oh, that's the free market, that's why we need government regulation. So no matter what happens, it's always capitalism's fault, and no matter how badly the regulators are asleep at the wheel and screw up, it doesn't matter. It always just proves they need more money from us, taken at gunpoint. That doesn't make sense. All right, so anyways, like I'm saying here, do not fall for this rhetorical move by which Yarn Brook is going to say, oh wow, the Indian